Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar about being a badass and brainstorming. Today we have Laura Hansen. She is eImagine's Vice President of Delivery Solutions. We thank you so much for joining today's webinar. We will just a few housekeeping items. So we would love to answer all of your questions. If you have any, please enter those in the chat. Time allowing, we will answer those as we can. We want to keep this to 30 minutes, obviously, and be respectful of everybody's schedule. So those questions that we do not get into, we will make sure that they are addressed after the call and will be in direct contact. So without further ado, we're going to pass the mic to Laura Hansen.
Great. Thank you, Hadley. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today. Really excited to be talking about how to be a badass brainstormer. Brainstorming is something that is really near and dear to my heart, and I'm really excited to share some of my experiences. So without further ado, we will just jump right in. So before we actually get into some of the content around becoming a badass brainstormer, let me give you a little bit of background about the presenting companies today. We have two. The first is eImagine. eImagine is an Indianapolis-based business and technology consulting firm. We were voted best places to work in Indiana for 6 years in a row, the past 6 years. We're also a certified small business, Salesforce consulting partner, Microsoft Gold partner, really amazing company. Our second amazing presenting company is AFIT. AFIT is an Indiana certified woman-owned enterprise. They have done some really fantastic work for a variety of customers that are presented in that grid on the screen that you see right there. They are focused on state and local government work. So thank you to eImagine and AFIT. So just kind of jumping in here, I thought it would be helpful to tell you a little bit about myself. So I have a background in project management. I've been doing IT project management for the past decade and a half. I've worked on a variety of projects, all different sizes, small projects that were a handful of hours, all the way up to very large projects that are several $million. And I currently run our delivery solutions team at eImagine, which is essentially our developers, our PMs, and our QAs and our BAs. So you may be wondering right now why you joined a presentation with badass in the title. We wanted to bring a little bit of playfulness, a little bit of fun to a topic that can be a little intimidating, especially if you haven't facilitated a lot of brainstorming sessions. It can be a little daunting to figure out where to start. So we wanted to bring a little bit of humor to the title of this session today. So a little bit more about me. I am actually an Air Force brat. I am not from Indiana originally. My dad was in the military. He was a career pilot, flew reconnaissance aircraft. So he flew the SR-71 and the U-2. My mom also started out in the military and eventually went into telecom. She worked her way up to be a C-level at a Fortune 500 company. And so my parents are both very driven, results focused, results oriented, detail oriented. And so that was really my life. That was my household growing up. And ironically, or maybe unironically, I tended to be a little bit more artistically inclined, especially as a kid. And, you know, my dad would lovingly refer to me as the cut and paste kid, because every time I had a project for school, I would immediately jump to the artistic component of the project. I would, whatever that, you know, putting together the visual for the project, making the construction paper dinosaur with little toilet paper legs, that was my jam. I was not about doing the piece of the project where you were actually graded. And so there was this constant misalignment in what our success looked like, that success criteria. How did we know if we were going to be successful at the end? And I always felt like that was something that was relegated to just me. But I'm here to tell you, as somebody who has been in software delivery for 15 years, that's not uncommon, right? A lot of times people have different expectations of what the end result's going to look like and what success looks like. And so the key is to really harness the collective brain power of everybody involved, engage in some badass brainstorming, and get a plan to move forward. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about being a badass brainstormer. The goal and intention of the session today is to make an impact on how you approach brainstorming. We're going to teach you some key concepts that will make your sessions more effective, more impactful, and you'll have better outcomes. So, what is a badass brainstormer? A badass brainstormer is somebody who is able to corral all the creative energy of their team. This could be ideas that are pitched in meetings, ideas that people, put into their OneNote, that they scribble on a scrap of paper, that they put in an Excel file. It's about channeling all of this information, all of these data points, and figuring out what are the themes, what do we need to pay attention to. And the really good news is that in order to be a really successful, badass brainstormer, you really just need to remember three things. So at the end of this presentation, you will have three takeaways. The first one is collecting data. The second one is leveraging comparison. And the third one is mastering the power of motion. So collecting data is really about the recognition that data by itself really means nothing. I think many times we get so excited about the brainstorming activity that we tend to lose sight of the people component, the being inclusive, holding people accountable to give you their opinions. So that's really what this first badass brainstormer takeaway is about. The second takeaway is about leveraging comparison. And so, what I mean by that is, again, to give data meaning, that data needs to have context. And especially when you think about brainstorming a large quantity of items, um, you're going to need to have that context in order to figure out what is priority, what do we want to move forward with. And what's really challenging is that you may not know something simple like, how much effort is involved in something, but you can probably pretty easily tell, this item involves more effort than this other item. For example, if you're wanting to tidy up your home and you just have a few minutes, you probably know that wiping down the countertops in your kitchen is going to take less time than cleaning all the floors in your house. So this second item is really about leveraging comparison, that relative sizing, to make your brainstorming successful. And the last one, that mastering the power of emotion or of motion, is about taking advantage of flow. And so you may not be familiar with that term, but flow, you've probably experienced when working in a team or working on a project, is when you get fully immersed. So you're fully immersed in what you're doing. You completely forget about the outside world and you feel happy, you're in control, you're productive, you're creative. But there's a catch. You feel that while you're brainstorming, but the second you stop that session, all of those feelings start to dissipate. And so it's really critical that you find a way to keep that motion going. So brainstorming, being a badass brainstormer, doesn't just stop when you close your brainstorming session. It's about everything you do prior to that and then after. So moving right along, I know that you probably noticed that the title of the session had affinity diagramming in the name. It wasn't just about badass brainstorming, it's about affinity diagramming. So what is affinity diagramming? So we have used affinity diagramming for several years now on a lot of our software implementation projects. It is not a new tool. It's not a proprietary tool. Interestingly enough, it's actually a tool created in the 60s It was created by the gentleman on the slide there. His name is Hiro Kawakita. He was an anthropologist and a professor. And essentially, the tool is used to take large amounts of data and figure out what are the natural relationships within that data. And the really cool thing about affinity diagramming is that you're able to bypass the left side of your brain by using the process that's defined from an affinity diagramming perspective. So essentially, you have all this data, you collect it, and then you're able to figure out how to group that data and then name that data, but you're not using that unconscious bias that you might have if you were thinking about it from a category perspective at first. The other great thing about affinity diagramming is that it is simple and it's scalable. So it's something that, you can use for day-to-day activities. We use them for quarterly planning meetings within different teams within our organization. We also use them for 40,000 hour plus huge software implementation. So it's a tool that you can scale up or scale down depending on what's needed. The last kind of key component or key characteristic of affinity diagramming is that it's really simple from a materials perspective. You really only need paper, pens, tape. You don't need anything proprietary to actually make good progress on affinity diagramming. So when do you use it? When is it appropriate to use affinity diagramming? If you are nodding your head yes to any of the statements on the screen right now, yes, you should use affinity diagramming. So if the goal, if the task, if the issue at hand is complex or hard to understand, yes, affinity diagramming is a good fit. If you feel uncertain about what the path forward is, if you feel disorganized, if you have this feeling of being overwhelmed, then affinity diagramming is a good fit. And if you need the involvement and the support of a group of people, and that could be people on your team, people in your organization, then affinity diagramming is also a good fit. So again, a wide variety of applications and very simple to scale up and scale down. So we're going to dig in a little bit more into those 3 badass brainstorming techniques or takeaways that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation. So number 1, if you remember, was collect data with inclusivity and accountability. And you'll notice we have a theme going here on the next 3 slides. We'll have how you actually affinity diagram, so the mechanics on one side of the slide, and then you're going to have some best practices on the other side of the slide. So just kind of jumping into that first takeaway for how to affinity diagram, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to collect all of your data. And so that data might be a goal for the quarter. Maybe you have a goal for your team that they are going to, get a certification for the quarter, or you want 2 people on your team to get a certification this quarter. You're going to collect all of those different data points on Post-it notes, on index cards, in an Excel spreadsheet. You just need to collect it. The second thing that you're going to do is you're going to cluster that data together. So you're going to take all of those different data points and you're going to put things that have a natural affinity, that have a relationship together. So if one team member, let's use our certification example, if one team member said, hey, I want 2 people on my team to get a cert. And then maybe somebody else said, well, I want somebody on my team to get a certified Scrum Master certification. That would go together, right? There's a natural affinity to those 2 goals. So we would cluster those 2 ideas, those 2 brainstormed items together. And then the last step to kind of this first takeaway is to name it. So we're going to name those clusters that we've developed from our data set. So if we have several items around certification, we might name it certification for Q4. Some of the best practices that you're going to see in this area that are really key, the first one is being well prepared and setting expectations. Not everybody is great at thinking on the spot. Some people are, they have that is their superpower. They can just immediately come up with new ideas. And then other people need some time to think things through. So make sure that you're preparing your team, you're telling them expectations. If you're trying to collect all of the brainstorm ideas ahead of the session, make sure you do that, you send it out. If it's supposed to be something that's a little more ad hoc, make sure you're set up to collect those ideas in your actual session. Number 2 and 3 there on the list, the involve all stakeholders and the no silent partners. That really speaks to being inclusive and accountable. So it's important to involve all the stakeholders on your team that will have a perspective or an input or opinion on whatever you're brainstorming regarding. And that even includes people that might not be your favorite people, or maybe have a tendency to focus on priorities that don't really jive with what you think of. But it's important to include all of those stakeholders. Also, hold people accountable. Nobody can hide in the corner. You can't have silent partners, and what you really want to avoid is having a meeting after the meeting. You want everybody to be shaking their head yes, to be cognizant of what we're all saying in that actual space. Um, the fourth one on the list, remember, there are no bad ideas. I know that feels like I'm your second grade teacher, but there really are no bad ideas. You want everybody to be submitting what they think is important, because at the end of the day, the affinity diagramming process is going to tease out anything that just won't work. And the last item is to inject energy. Have fun with it. If you're having fun, your team's going to have fun, and that's really contagious. The second badass brainstormer takeaway is to leverage comparison to prioritize. And so if we focus here on the how to affinity diagram, the first step is going to be to figure out our yardstick. And what I mean by that is figure out what is important to your organization or your team or your goals. You might be very time focused. So, how much time does a particular activity take? You might be very cost focused. You might be worried about how much does it cost for me to achieve this goal. You might be concerned with all of the bells and whistles. So, you might be very feature oriented. But the first step here is to figure out, how do we actually want to measure our success? What is that criteria? And that's really about identifying that yardstick. The second thing that you're going to do is to compare. So again, kind of going back to our earlier story about tidying up your house, it's really difficult for humans to figure out how long things take, but we inherently know when something is larger or smaller than another thing. And you're going to do the same. So you're going to take 2 items. In our certification example, you might have, getting 1 cert, having the team get 2 certs, or having somebody get a particular cert. Well, it might be easier for 1 person to get a particular cert than to convince 2 people to get a certification. So if you're looking at it from a cost perspective, then it's more expensive for 2 people to get certification. So that would be larger than, 1 person to get a particular certification, which would be smaller. So that's going to be your second step there. And then your third step, which really goes along with that comparison, is you're just going to prioritize. So as you're comparing items, you will rank them in their order according to whatever your yardstick is. So if it's by cost, you're going to line everything up by cost. If it's by time, it's going to be based on your effort. So with those 3 easy steps, you're really accomplishing that second comparison to prioritize takeaway. And then some of our best practices here. One is know your reality. Don't prioritize bells and whistles if your biggest concern is cost. So if you know that that's really what's important, is, hey, we're constrained by cost. And I think especially in the era of COVID, and knowing that a lot of people's budgets have been impacted by that, it's important to realize that, and to have that play into how you're actually brainstorming. The second thing is that you can actually apply more than 1 yardstick. So if you feel like 2 of those factors, maybe it's time and cost are important to you. Go through all your items and compare them by time, and then go through all your items and compare them by cost. And now you have two dimensions to really prioritize all the items that you'd like to complete. The third one on the list is to keep it simple, just like it sounds. Don't overcomplicate things. If you have an item and maybe one's number 9 on the list and one is number 10, that probably doesn't really matter. You really want to look at the big swings. So, if something is number 1 on the list versus number 10 on the list, that's probably something you need to actually talk through. And that really goes into number 4 there of don't let the team spin too long. Don't let them get into analysis paralysis. And then the last item on the list is group nod. So make sure that your team is all on board. What you don't want to do is think that you've made a decision as a team, and then later on you find out that other people don't agree. The third takeaway from a badass brainstorming perspective is to master the power of motion. And so, what you're going to do here is slice, we've called it slice, but you're going to pick a portion of the stories that you want to complete. So, that could be, if you're looking at 2 dimensions, maybe you're looking at the things that are lowest cost and take the least amount of time. Or if you're just concerned with bells and whistles, maybe you're taking the things that deliver the most value. So in this step, you're going to figure out, what does your slice of your brainstorming look like? And then next, you're going to take action. So make sure that you're not leaving that affinity diagramming session without a next step, without something that you're going to do with that slice of brainstorming. And so some best practices here. First one being is to get in motion. Whatever you're doing, do not let the momentum of the session dissipate. You need to keep things moving, keep people engaged, keep them excited about what you're doing, and don't let the flow that you've built up through this affinity diagramming session dissipate. The second one is that decisions matter. It's really about, you're in this meeting, everybody is a stakeholder, you're an expert, we're holding people accountable, and whatever decisions we make in that meeting, those decisions stick. The next item on the list is don't wrap up your session without commitment. Don't let people waver or disagree. Walk through all those items in the session. Otherwise, you're not going to get resolution to what are we moving forward with. Fourth item on the list is really to communicate. Something that our company president says all the time, and I feel like it's so easy to forget even now after probably hearing it 100 times, is it takes 7 times of somebody hearing something for it to really sink in. So you might feel like you're communicating really well after a brainstorming session, but I can tell you that that might just still be noise to the team. So make sure that you are communicating, over communicate. And the last is to rinse and repeat. We have customers that we work with that we do affinity diagramming at the start of every single sprint. You don't have to do a one and done affinity diagram. You can use it at the beginning of a project, the beginning of a quarter, for a particular thing you're trying to solve with your team, but you can rinse and repeat affinity diagramming with great success. And so we thought it would be helpful, in addition to really those 3 takeaways, to talk a little bit about affinity diagramming in practice. What does it look like in the real world? So eImagine has actually, as I mentioned before, been using affinity diagramming for many years now on many software projects. One project in particular, and this is a picture from that, is a project that we completed with the Indiana Secretary of State. And essentially, we were unifying their systems, their business processes, and we were leveraging Microsoft Dynamics to do that. And as part of the requirements gathering for that project, we actually had collected over 200 user stories. And for those that may not be familiar with that term, a user story is essentially just a statement about what somebody can do in a software system. So as a blank type of user, I should be able to perform XYZ actions so that I accomplish this goal. And so we had 200 user stories, and we were able to prioritize those user stories from business users, as well as estimate the effort from technical staff in 2 hours. So just let that sink in. We had 2 hours and we went through 200 stories. That is less than a minute per story. So I think that that really speaks to the power of affinity diagramming as a really valuable brainstorming tool. The next example that I felt would be really helpful to share is something that we've used internally. On the screen there, you see a whiteboard, and that's actually something that we did as a recruiting team. We were trying to solve the problem of how do we, quote unquote, fill our recruiting pipeline? How do we get the best candidates? And so we essentially used a whiteboard, a combination of a whiteboard and an Excel spreadsheet to collect, cluster, name, and prioritize how we would further bolster our recruiting pipeline. And it was hugely successful. As I mentioned before, we've used it in a lot of other different areas within eImagine, within our leadership team, within the recruiting group, within people solutions, within our consultant training program, which is called E3. Again, affinity diagramming is scalable. Especially in the era of COVID, I know, a lot of people are not working from their offices. You're probably sitting in your living room right now and you're thinking, how am I gonna use a tool like affinity diagramming where people are writing on Post-its and paper and taping it on the wall and do it successfully? Well, the great news is that there are a lot of digital tools that you can leverage to be a badass brainstormer. You can use it to do affinity diagramming. And so I've listed out a few here within this deck. I also just wanted to highlight a couple. I know some of the folks on the call here work for state government. I know that it can be difficult to procure additional software. It can take time to get through that procurement process. So there are a couple of free tools. One is Trello. You can create free boards within Trello. The other one is Microsoft. Surprisingly, Microsoft has an affinity diagramming template for PowerPoint that you can download, and you could leverage that with your teams as well. Some really great digital options. So just kind of putting everything together and wrapping everything up. Just some what, when, how, and what results you're going to get from being a badass brainstormer. So from a what perspective, when you are badass brainstorming, you are trying to bring clarity. So you're trying to give everybody on the team, you're trying to collect those ideas, you're trying to group them, cluster them, and then figure out what is that valuable path forward, what is going to bring the most to your team. And you're really focused on getting a unique perspective and bringing those perspectives together. If you're faced with a complex situation and uncertain situation, or you need support of the team, that's a great time to use a tool like affinity diagramming. In terms of how, we have our three badass brainstorming takeaways. Just as a reminder, you are going to collect data with inclusivity and accountability, leverage comparison to prioritize, and master the power of motion. And then finally, what results are you getting? The result, because at the end of the day, success of a particular undertaking is the outcome. Make sure that you're getting the outcomes that are important to your organization. And if you can put all of those things together, you too can be a badass brainstormer. So I just want to thank everybody for taking 30 minutes and spending it with us as we're talking about being a BAB or a badass brainstormer. I will say we will be reaching out after our webinar today with a link to our affinity diagramming white paper so that you too can learn more about it. I do want to thank eImagine and AFIT, the presenting companies today. And if you do have questions, you want to learn more about affinity diagramming, or you have situations that you've run into, particular situations you have questions on, or if you're interested in getting some help in leading your own affinity diagramming session on us, reach out, just email bab@eimagine.com. So thank you all so much. And if we have time for questions, we could absolutely dig into those.
Guys, it's Hadley again with eImagine and AFIT. I thought I'd just do some final housekeeping. So obviously we've gone just slightly over today, but it does not mean we don't want to answer your questions. So please feel free, like Laura said, to email us at bab@eimagine.com and we will be in touch. Thanks so much for joining, and everybody have a great rest of your day.